The gateway station floated in space like a bright jewel against the darkness. It was huge and beautiful with lights shining from thousands of windows. This was the biggest travel hub that humans had ever built between the stars. Every day more than 50,000 travelers passed through here. They came from 17 different alien species and from human colonies scattered across many planets. The station never slept and never stopped moving. Marcus Bennett stood near the arrival gate with his younger sister Nina beside him. Marcus was 23 years old and had just finished his studies about alien life forms at the Mars Institute. Nina was 19 and excited to start her own journey into space. They had spent 3 long weeks traveling from Earth on a transport ship called the Stellar Horizon. The ship had been crowded and the rooms were small. Both of them were tired and their bodies ached from sleeping in narrow beds. They wanted nothing more than to sit in comfortable chairs and rest. Their next flight would not leave for another 6 hours. The flight would take them to a research colony on a planet called Kepler. Marcus would study the tiny creatures that lived there while Nina would learn about the plants. But right now they just wanted to find a quiet place to sit and maybe get something to eat. The main area of the station was full of noise and movement. People and aliens walked in every direction. Some carried large bags while others pulled rolling cases behind them. Marcus noticed merchants from one star system arguing with traders from another system about prices. He saw blue-skinned diplomats in long flowing robes walking past with serious faces. There were also some strange bug-like aliens clicking and making odd sounds through small devices that helped them talk. The variety of life here amazed him. He had studied alien biology for years, but seeing it in person was different. It made him feel small but also excited about the universe. Nina adjusted the strap of her travel bag and looked around with wide eyes. She had dreamed about this moment since she was a little girl. She used to watch videos about space travel and imagine herself walking through stations like this. Now she was finally here, but she felt nervous. Everything seemed so big and confusing. There were signs in multiple languages, including some that used symbols she could not read. The air smelled strange, too, like metal and cleaning products mixed with food from dozens of worlds. Marcus noticed his sister looking uncertain. He was taller than her, and had inherited their father's calm way of handling things. He put his hand on her shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. That small gesture made Nina feel better. She smiled at him and took a deep breath. They would figure this out together just like they always did. Marcus pointed up at a sign that caught his attention. The sign said Premium Travelers Lounge and it glowed with soft blue light. The sign promised comfortable seating and free food and drinks. It also mentioned private rest areas where tired travelers could relax away from the crowds. After 3 weeks in cramped ship quarters, this sounded like heaven to both of them. Marcus pulled out his data pad, which was a thin electronic device that held all their travel information. He scrolled through the booking details that their father had arranged before they left Earth. Their father worked for a big company called Stellar Transit Lines that operated many ships between the stars. Because of his important job, they usually got special treatment when they traveled. Marcus found what he was looking for. Right there in the confirmation message, it clearly stated that they had access to premium lounges at all major stations. He showed the screen to Nina and she smiled with relief. They would get to rest in comfort after all. Together they started walking through the crowd toward the lounge entrance. Neither of them paid attention to the other travelers around them. They did not notice how some people looked at them and then looked away quickly. They were too focused on the promise of soft chairs and cold drinks. The walk to the lounge took about 10 minutes because they had to weave through the busy terminal. They passed restaurants serving food from Earth and food from alien worlds. They walked by shops selling everything from clothing to electronic devices to strange items they could not identify. There were information desks where confused travelers asked questions in a dozen different languages. Automated cleaning robots rolled past them, making soft humming sounds as they worked. Finally, they reached the entrance to the Premium Travelers Lounge. The doors were made of frosted glass that looked expensive. Through the glass, they could see the lounge interior. It looked peaceful and quiet compared to the chaos of the main terminal. There were comfortable-looking chairs arranged in small groups. Some had views of space through large windows. Marcus could see other travelers already inside. Some were reading on their data pads while others talked quietly or simply rested with their eyes closed. Nina felt excited as they approached the entrance. She imagined sinking into one of those soft chairs and finally being able to relax. Maybe she would get something to drink and watch the stars through the window. Marcus felt the same way. His back hurt from carrying his bag and his feet were sore from walking. He was ready to sit down and not move for the next several hours. The glass doors would open automatically when authorized guests approached them. They walked forward expecting the doors to slide open. Inside the entrance there was a reception desk. Behind the desk stood a gray-skinned alien with large dark eyes and no hair. Marcus recognized the species as Zentari. The Zentari were known for being very organized and following rules carefully. This particular Zentari wore the standard uniform of station workers. His name tag identified him as Velcorum. As Marcus and Nina approached the desk, Velcorum looked up from whatever he was doing. His large eyes fixed on them and something changed in his expression. It was subtle, but Marcus noticed it. The alien's face seemed to tighten slightly, as if he had just seen something unpleasant. Marcus tried to ignore the feeling of discomfort that crept up his spine. He stepped up to the desk and gave the attendant a polite smile. He held out his data pad with the screen showing their booking confirmation and lounge access credentials. This was something he had done many times before at different stations across the solar system. It was always quick and easy. The worker would scan the credentials and welcome them inside. The whole process usually took less than a minute. But this time was different. Velcorum barely glanced at the datapad that Marcus held out. His thin gray fingers hovered over his terminal, but he did not actually touch any buttons. He did not make any move to scan their credentials. Instead, his gaze moved slowly from Marcus to Nina and back again. He looked at them in a way that made Marcus feel uncomfortable. It was not a friendly look or even a neutral professional look. There was something cold and judgmental in those large, dark eyes. Marcus felt Nina shift her weight beside him. She had noticed the strange behavior, too. They waited for the attendant to do his job and check their credentials. The seconds stretched out awkwardly. Finally, Velcorum spoke. His voice was clipped and formal without any warmth. He said that this lounge was reserved for premium members only. He said they did not qualify for access. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He blinked in confusion and looked down at his data pad to make sure he had not made a mistake. No, the credentials were right there on the screen. Premium lounge access was clearly listed in their booking. Marcus looked back up at the attendant with a puzzled frown. He explained that their credentials were valid and offered to let Velcorum scan them. There must have been some kind of confusion or maybe a computer error. These things happened sometimes with space travel. Systems had glitches and mistakes occurred. It would only take a moment to verify their access and clear up the misunderstanding. But Velcorum did not reach for the datapad. He did not even look at it again. Instead, he repeated what he had said before. The lounge was for premium members only. They did not qualify. His tone suggested that the conversation was over. Marcus felt his confusion turning into frustration. Why would the attendant not simply scan their credentials? What possible reason could there be to refuse such a basic request? Nina stepped forward beside her brother. Her voice was sharper than Marcus's when she spoke. She pointed out that there was clearly no mistake, and asked him to just scan the credentials. It would take only 5 seconds to verify. The attendant's expression grew harder. He said he did not need to scan anything. He said the lounge maintained certain standards. He said they could not have just anyone wandering in, and he was sure they understood. The implication in his words was clear even if he did not say it directly. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. This was not about credentials or computer errors or standards. This was about something else entirely, something ugly and unfair that he had experienced before but never quite so openly. Marcus looked past the attendant through the glass partition into the lounge. He could see passengers of different species sitting comfortably inside. There was a family of crystalline aliens from Rigel whose bodies sparkled with rainbow colors. 2 blue-skinned diplomats were having a quiet conversation near a table with drinks. In one corner, he saw a human couple sitting on a sofa. Both of them had pale skin and blonde hair. They were looking at documents on their data pads and seemed completely relaxed. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He looked back at Velcorum and kept his voice steady even though he wanted to shout. He explained that he did not know what the problem was, but their access was legitimate. He mentioned that his father was Gregory Bennett, who was an executive director of operations for Stellar Transit Lines. He said his father had arranged this booking personally. If the attendant would just verify the credentials, they could clear this up right away. Mentioning his father's name and position usually helped in situations like this. Companies knew the Bennett name. People understood that Gregory Bennett was an important person in the space travel industry. But this time it did not seem to matter at all. Velkorum's expression did not change. If anything, he seemed to become more dismissive. He repeated again that the lounge was at capacity. He said they would need to find accommodations elsewhere. His tone made it clear that he considered the conversation finished. Nina pointed toward the lounge interior. Her voice was rising with frustration. She said the lounge was at capacity, but she could see at least a dozen empty seats from where they stood. The lie was so obvious it was insulting. Did the attendant really think they were stupid enough to believe him? Velkorum's eyes narrowed. He said he did not appreciate her tone. He warned that if they continued to cause a disturbance, he would have no choice but to call station security. Marcus felt Nina tense beside him. He knew his sister well enough to recognize when she was about to lose her temper. Nina had always been quick to speak up against injustice. It was one of the things he admired about her, but it also sometimes got her into trouble. He put a gentle hand on her arm as a silent request for patience, but inside his own anger was building. They had done nothing wrong. They had valid credentials and a legitimate reason to be here, yet they were being turned away based on nothing more than prejudice. Other travelers were starting to notice the confrontation. Some slowed down as they walked past the lounge entrance. A few stopped completely to watch what was happening. Marcus could feel their eyes on him and Nina. Some faces showed sympathy while others showed nothing at all. A few people even seemed to approve of what the attendant was doing. The galaxy was a big place with many different species and cultures, but prejudice existed everywhere. Marcus had learned that lesson many times during his life. A woman approached the lounge entrance. She was middle-aged with pale skin that suggested she came from somewhere in Northern Europe. She carried herself with confidence like someone who was used to getting what she wanted. As she got closer, her eyes flickered between Marcus, Nina, and the attendant. Velkorum's whole attitude transformed instantly. His rigid posture relaxed, and something that might have been a smile appeared on his gray face. He greeted the woman warmly and welcomed her back. He said her usual seat was available. The woman whose name tag said Erickson gave a brief nod and held out her data pad. Velkorum scanned it immediately without hesitation. The whole transaction took less than 10 seconds. Then she walked past Marcus and Nina as if they were invisible. She did not look at them or acknowledge them in any way. She simply swept into the lounge and disappeared among the comfortable chairs. Marcus watched this happen and felt something cold settle in his chest. The attendant had just done exactly what he claimed was unnecessary for their credentials. Nina's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Marcus could feel the anger radiating from her like heat. He understood completely. They had just watched the attendant perform the exact action he refused to do for them. The double standard could not have been more obvious. It was not about protocols or capacity or standards. It was about the color of their skin. It was about who they were versus who that other woman was. The realization hurt even though Marcus had suspected it from the beginning. Marcus stepped closer to the desk. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. He pointed out that the attendant had just scanned that woman's credentials in 2 seconds. He asked why he would not scan theirs. Velkorum's mask of professional courtesy was back in place. He explained that the woman was a registered Platinum member. He said her credentials were already verified in their system. He insisted that their access could not be confirmed. He suggested again that they move along to the standard waiting area in the main concourse. The lie was transparent, but Velkorum did not seem to care. Marcus opened his mouth to argue further, but Nina cut him off. She said they should just go. Her voice carried defeat rather than anger now. That hurt Marcus more than anything the attendant had said. He recognized the look on his sister's face. It was the expression of someone who had learned that fighting back was often more exhausting than simply accepting injustice. He had seen that look on many faces before, including his own in mirrors, but Marcus was not ready to give up yet. He pulled out his personal communicator, which was a small device he wore on his wrist. He composed a message to their father explaining what was happening. Gregory Bennett would want to know about this situation. More importantly, their father had the authority and influence to do something about it. Marcus typed quickly describing the attendant's refusal to scan their credentials and the obvious discrimination they were experiencing. He hit send and the message disappeared into the communication network that connected all the human colonies. As Marcus finished sending the message, a voice spoke from behind them. The voice said, "Excuse me." Marcus turned to find a young human man standing there. He looked to be a few years older than Marcus, with dark hair and olive-colored skin. The stranger's face showed a mixture of sympathy and anger. He said he had seen what just happened. He said it was completely out of line. He introduced himself as Carlos Martinez and explained that he worked for the station's Civil Rights Compliance Office. Carlos looked at Velcorum with obvious disgust. Then he turned back to Marcus and Nina. He said if they wanted to file a formal complaint, he could help them do that. He explained that the station had procedures for dealing with discrimination. Nina looked at her brother with hope flickering in her eyes. Marcus considered the offer carefully. A formal complaint would create an official record. It would force an investigation. But it would also take time, and their flight was scheduled to leave in less than 6 hours. Still, the principle mattered. What happened to them today could happen to other travelers tomorrow. If they stayed silent, nothing would change. Marcus made his decision. He said yes, they would like to file a complaint. Carlos pulled a datapad from his jacket pocket and began recording their account of the incident. As they spoke, more passengers walked past the lounge entrance. Some stopped to listen while others hurried by without looking. The expressions on their faces ranged from sympathy to indifference to something that looked almost like approval. Marcus realized that the galaxy was not so different from Earth after all. Humanity had built amazing ships that could travel between the stars. They had created stations like this one that hosted multiple alien species. They had reached out into the universe and made contact with civilizations that had existed for thousands of years. But they had also brought their old prejudices with them. Technology had advanced, but human nature remained complicated. Some people still judged others based on appearance rather than character. Carlos asked them detailed questions about what had happened. He recorded the exact time and took note of other witnesses who had been present. He asked if they had recordings or other evidence. Marcus showed him the message thread with their booking confirmation and the premium lounge access clearly listed. Carlos photographed the screen with his datapad. He also noted that several other people had witnessed the attendant scanning the other woman's credentials while refusing to scan theirs. The whole process took about 20 minutes. When they finished, Carlos assured them that the station took discrimination seriously. He said an investigation would be launched immediately. He promised to follow up with them within 48 hours. Marcus could hear the weariness in the man's voice, though. It was the tone of someone who had made similar promises before and seen little real change. Still, Marcus appreciated that Carlos had stepped in to help. At least someone cared about what was right. As they finished filing the complaint, Marcus's communicator chimed. He looked down at the screen and saw a message from his father. His heart beat faster as he read it. Gregory Bennett's face appeared in miniature on the holographic display. Even in the tiny projection, their father's presence was commanding. The message was brief but clear. He said he had received Marcus's report. He said this situation was completely unacceptable. He was on his way to the station right now. His estimated time of arrival was 45 minutes. He told them to wait for him at the lounge entrance and not to engage with the staff until he arrived. Marcus and Nina left the lounge entrance and made their way back into the main concourse. They found 2 empty seats near a large viewport that showed the stars outside. The view was beautiful, with distant stars twinkling like tiny diamonds scattered across black cloth. A transport ship glided past slowly with its running lights creating streaks of color against the darkness. The station rotated gently on its axis, so every few minutes a different section of space would appear in the window. Nina sat down and crossed her arms over her chest. She stared out at the void beyond the glass, but Marcus could tell she was not really seeing it. Her jaw was set in a hard line. He knew his sister well enough to recognize when she was processing something difficult. Nina had always been the more outspoken of the 2 siblings. She was quick to anger, but also quick to forgive. Right now, she was working through her feelings about what had just happened. Marcus decided to let her have her silence. He checked his communicator again, but there was still no new message from their father. Gregory Bennett was probably busy arranging his travel to the station, or dealing with the various problems that always seemed to demand his attention. Running operations for one of humanity's largest space travel companies meant constant pressure and endless decisions. Marcus had seen his father handle crises before. Gregory never panicked and never raised his voice, but he got results. Around them, the station continued its normal activity. The concourse was still crowded with travelers moving in every direction. A group of human children ran past laughing and shouting as they played some kind of game. Their parents followed behind at a slower pace, calling out warnings about not bumping into other people. An automated cleaning robot floated by overhead, making soft humming sounds as its sensors scanned for dirt or damage. The machine moved smoothly around the overhead lights and signs. Marcus noticed a vendor's cart nearby selling food from different worlds. The smell of grilled meat and spices drifted through the air, making his stomach growl. He realized they had not eaten anything in several hours. He nudged Nina gently and pointed toward the cart. He asked if she wanted something to eat. Nina shook her head without looking at him. She said she was not hungry. Marcus knew that was not true, but he understood. Sometimes when you were upset, food was the last thing on your mind. Still, they needed to eat something. Marcus stood up and walked over to the vendor. The vendor was a short alien with mottled green skin and 4 arms. Marcus did not recognize the species, which was not unusual. The galaxy contained thousands of different intelligent species. New ones were being discovered all the time as exploration ships pushed further into unexplored space. The vendor greeted him in broken English and gestured at the various foods on display. Marcus ordered 2 meals that looked like rice with vegetables and strips of meat. The vendor worked quickly, using all 4 arms at once. He scooped rice into containers and added vegetables from different pots. He drizzled sauce over everything and sealed the containers with plastic lids. Marcus paid with his credit chip, which automatically deducted the amount from his account. The vendor handed him the 2 warm containers, and Marcus thanked him before returning to his seat. He set one container in Nina's lap and told her to eat. She looked down at the food and then at her brother. For a moment he thought she might refuse, but then hunger won out over stubbornness. She picked up the fork that came with the container and started eating. At first she just picked at the food, but gradually she began eating properly. Marcus ate his own meal in silence. The food was decent, though not amazing. It had a slightly strange taste that suggested alien spices or maybe just different preparation methods. They sat together, watching the flow of traffic through the terminal. Marcus found himself studying the people and aliens that passed by. He noticed how diverse the crowd was. Humans of every background moved alongside aliens of every imaginable form. There were tall ones and short ones, furry ones and scaly ones that walked on 2 legs and ones that seemed to float. In theory, they were all equal members of the Andromeda Trade Coalition. In practice, as today had shown, equality was still more of a goal than a reality. Nina finished her meal and set the empty container aside. She turned to look at her brother. Her voice was quieter now, without the anger it had carried before. She said this was not the first time something like this had happened. She said it would not be the last time either. Marcus nodded slowly. He knew she was right. He had experienced discrimination before in various forms. Sometimes it was obvious, like today. Other times it was more subtle. A clerk who followed you in a store. A teacher who had lower expectations. A person who clutched their bag tighter when you walked past. Marcus's communicator chimed, making both siblings jump slightly. He looked down at the screen and saw another message from their father. Gregory's face appeared in the holographic display again. This time the message was even shorter. He said he would arrive at the station in 15 minutes. He told them to meet him at the lounge entrance. Marcus showed the message to Nina and she sat up straighter. The waiting was almost over. Soon their father would be here and something would happen. They gathered their belongings and made their way back toward the premium traveler's lounge. The walk took only a few minutes. When they arrived, they positioned themselves near but not directly in front of the entrance. Marcus did not want another confrontation with Velcorum before their father arrived. Other travelers continued passing by, some entering the lounge with no problems at all. Marcus watched as the attendant greeted them warmly and scanned their credentials without hesitation. The minutes ticked by slowly. Marcus checked his communicator repeatedly, even though he knew it had only been a minute or 2 since the last time he looked. Nina stood beside him, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She was nervous and excited at the same time. She had seen their father handle difficult situations before, but never one quite like this. She wondered what he would do. Would he yell at the attendant? Would he demand to speak to a manager? Would he threaten legal action? Then Marcus spotted him. Their father emerged from the crowd, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Gregory Bennett was a tall man in his early 50s. His hair was more gray than black now, but his presence commanded attention. He wore a dark suit that marked him as someone important, even among the well-dressed business travelers that frequented the station. But it was more than his clothing. It was the way he carried himself with confidence and authority. He was not alone. Two other people walked with him. One was a woman Marcus recognized as Helen Porter, who was the director of customer relations for Stellar Transit Lines. She was in her 40s with auburn hair pulled back tightly. Her green eyes were sharp and alert, taking in everything around her. The other person was a man Marcus did not know. He wore a station security uniform, and the insignia on his shoulder suggested he held a high rank in Gateway Station's security department. Gregory's face was controlled and almost neutral, but Marcus knew his father well enough to see the anger beneath the surface. It showed in the slight tension around his eyes and the set of his jaw. This was Gregory Bennett in full executive mode. This was the version of himself that had negotiated contracts worth billions of credits. This was the man who had faced down corporate rivals and won. Marcus felt a surge of pride mixed with relief. His father was here and things were about to change. As Gregory approached, his gaze swept over his children. It was a quick assessment to make sure they were unharmed. Then his attention shifted to the premium traveler's lounge entrance where Velcorum still stood at the reception desk. Marcus saw the moment when the Zentari attendant looked up and recognized who was walking toward him. The color seemed to drain from Velcorum's already gray skin. His large dark eyes widened in what could only be described as fear. He clearly knew who Gregory Bennett was. Gregory stopped directly in front of the desk. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured. Somehow that made it more intimidating than if he had shouted. He introduced himself as Gregory Bennett, Executive Director of Operations for Stellar Transit Lines. He identified Marcus and Nina as his children. He said he understood there had been an incident here approximately 1 hour ago. He stated that he would like to hear the attendant's explanation. The words were polite, but they carried an unmistakable weight of authority. Velcorum's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaky. He said there had been a misunderstanding about access credentials. He claimed he was simply following standard protocol for verifying premium memberships. His explanation sounded weak and unconvincing even to his own ears. Gregory's eyebrow rose just a fraction of an inch. He repeated the phrase standard protocol as if tasting it and finding it distasteful. Gregory asked if it was standard protocol to refuse to scan offered credentials. The question hung in the air. Velcorum scrambled for an answer. He said there had been a technical issue with the scanner at that moment. Gregory pulled out his own datapad and tapped the screen several times. He said he was looking at the lounge's system logs right now. He pointed out that no technical issues were reported during the time in question. Velcorum's voice took on a desperate edge. He apologized and said if there had been any confusion, he may have made an error in judgment. The words sounded hollow. Helen Porter spoke for the first time since arriving. Her voice was crisp and professional without any warmth. She said there was no error in judgment. She said there was a deliberate decision to deny access based on discriminatory criteria. She stated firmly that this was not a misunderstanding, but a violation of both company policy and coalition civil rights law. Gregory's gaze never left the attendant. He said he wanted to be very clear about something. He explained that Stellar Transit Lines had partnerships with Gateway Station worth billions of credits every year. He pointed out that his company accounted for approximately 30% of all passenger traffic through this facility. Those partnerships, he continued, were dependent on the station maintaining certain standards of service and non-discrimination. His words were measured but carried an unmistakable threat. Gregory paused to let that information sink in. Then he continued speaking. He said when his children presented valid premium credentials and were turned away, it was not just a personal insult. It was a breach of the service agreement between their companies. More importantly, he added it was a moral failure that reflected poorly on the entire station. Marcus watched his father and felt a mixture of emotions. Part of him was grateful that someone with power was finally addressing the injustice. Another part felt uncomfortable about needing that power to be treated fairly. Chief Langford cleared his throat. He assured Gregory that this incident was not representative of Gateway Station's values or policies. He said the station took discrimination seriously, and appropriate disciplinary action would be taken. Gregory finally looked away from Velcorum to face the security chief. He said he appreciated that, But disciplinary action against one employee was not sufficient. He wanted more than just punishment for this particular attendant. Gregory outlined his demands. He wanted a full audit of the lounge's admission practices over the past year. He wanted to know how many other passengers had been turned away inappropriately. He wanted a comprehensive retraining program implemented for all customer-facing staff, not just in this lounge, but throughout the station. His voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. This was not a request, but a requirement. The security chief nodded slowly and said these were reasonable requests. He promised to speak with Station Director Kim and ensure they were implemented. Other passengers had gathered around to watch the confrontation. Some held up their communicators, recording everything. In the age of instant communication across star systems, news traveled fast. Marcus realized that within hours this incident would be known across human space and beyond. Videos would be shared on social media platforms. News organizations would pick up the story. The confrontation between Gregory Bennett and the discriminatory attendant would become public knowledge. That publicity might accomplish more than any official complaint. Gregory turned to his children. His expression softened slightly when he looked at them. He asked if they were all right. Marcus nodded and said they were fine. Nina said the same, though her voice was thick with emotion. Gregory put a hand on each of their shoulders. He said he was sorry they had to experience this. He said no one should be judged by their appearance rather than their credentials. Marcus felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away. He was grateful for his father's support. Helen Porter approached the desk where Vel Coram still stood looking miserable. She informed him that Stellar Transit Lines would be filing a formal complaint with both the station management and the Andromeda Trade Coalition's Civil Rights Commission. She stated that the company would also be reviewing all of their partnerships with Gateway Station. The attendant seemed to shrink under her gaze. He nodded weakly, unable to meet her eyes. His earlier arrogance had completely disappeared. Chief Langford gestured toward the lounge entrance. He said that Marcus and Nina should be granted immediate access with the station's sincere apologies. He personally escorted them through the glass doors into the lounge. The staff inside immediately sprang into action, offering them the best seats and bringing refreshments. The contrast with their earlier treatment was stark and somewhat uncomfortable. Marcus and Nina were finally being treated well, but only because their father had intervened with power and influence. Gregory followed them into the lounge along with Helen Porter. Chief Langford excused himself to make calls about implementing the changes that Gregory had demanded. Inside the lounge it was quiet and peaceful, just as it had appeared from outside. The comfortable chairs were arranged in small groups. Large viewports showed spectacular views of space. Other passengers sat reading or talking quietly or simply resting. Some of them watched Gregory and his children with curiosity. A lounge staff member rushed over, offering them seats near a viewport with a particularly good view. She asked what she could bring them to drink or eat. Her eagerness to please was obvious and slightly embarrassing. Marcus requested water while Nina asked for juice. Gregory ordered coffee. They settled into the comfortable chairs that Marcus and Nina had been denied access to an hour earlier. The irony was not lost on any of them. For several minutes they sat in silence. Marcus stared out at the stars, trying to process everything that had happened. He had known intellectually that discrimination existed in the galaxy. He had experienced it before in smaller ways. But today's incident had been so blatant and so cruel. The attendant had not even tried to hide his prejudice. He had simply wielded his small amount of power to hurt people he considered beneath him. That kind of casual cruelty was harder to accept than more subtle forms of bias. Nina broke the silence. She asked their father how he had gotten to the station so quickly. Gregory explained that he had been inspecting one of the company's orbital maintenance facilities about 2 hours away. When he received Marcus's message, he immediately arranged for emergency transport. He said there was no way he would let his children face this alone. The company had fast ships available for executive use, and he had commandeered one without hesitation. Family came first, even before business. Marcus thanked his father for coming. Gregory shook his head and said there was no need for thanks. He said this was not just about his children, though of course they mattered most to him. This was about a principle. If the station allowed this kind of discrimination to continue, it would poison the entire facility. Other travelers would suffer the same treatment. The reputation of Gateway Station would be damaged. More importantly, it violated the basic ideals that the Andromeda Trade Coalition was supposed to represent. Helen Porter added her thoughts. She said discrimination was not just morally wrong but also bad for business. When customers felt unwelcome or mistreated, they took their business elsewhere. Stellar Transit Lines could not partner with facilities that drove customers away through prejudice. The company had built its reputation on treating all passengers fairly regardless of their species or background. That commitment extended to their partners as well. Any facility that wanted to work with Stellar Transit Lines needed to meet the same standards. A woman approached their group. She introduced herself as Lisa Chen from the station's Civil Rights Office. She said she worked with Carlos Martinez, who had helped Marcus and Nina file their initial complaint. Lisa expressed her personal apologies for what had happened. She said Velcorum's actions were inexcusable and represented a failure of the station's oversight systems. She explained that immediate changes were being implemented to prevent similar incidents in the future. Nina asked what kind of changes they were talking about. Lisa consulted her datapad and listed several initiatives. First, there would be mandatory anti-discrimination training for all customer-facing staff starting next week. Second, a new protocol would require supervisory review of any refused access with immediate escalation to the Civil Rights Office. Third, an audit would examine the past year's access denials to identify any patterns of discrimination. Fourth, the station would establish a passenger advocacy board with representation from diverse communities. Marcus felt cautiously hopeful. These sounded like real substantive measures, not just empty promises. But he also wondered if they would actually be enforced. How many times had organizations announced new policies only to let them quietly fade away? He asked Lisa directly whether these changes would really happen. She met his gaze steadily. She admitted she could not promise perfection. Changing institutional culture took time and effort, but she promised they were taking this seriously. Gregory's intervention had given them leverage they had not had before. Gregory checked his communicator and announced that Marcus and Nina's flight would begin boarding in 90 minutes. He suggested they should start heading toward the departure gate soon. But first he wanted to finalize some details with the station management. He excused himself along with Helen Porter to attend a meeting with Station Director Kim. He told his children to rest and recover. They had been through an ordeal and deserved some peace. Marcus and Nina watched their father leave, feeling grateful but also thoughtful. 3 months passed since the incident at Gateway Station. Marcus and Nina had settled into their new lives on Kepler. The research colony was small but vibrant, with scientists from many different fields working together. Marcus spent his days studying the microscopic organisms that lived in the planet's soil and water. Nina documented the complex relationships between different plant species. The work was challenging and rewarding. It gave them both a sense of purpose and accomplishment. The planet itself was beautiful in ways that Earth could never match. Kepler had 2 moons that created spectacular tides and unusual light patterns at night. The sky was a slightly different shade of blue than Earth's. The air smelled clean and fresh without the pollution that still plagued some parts of their home world. Strange birds with 4 wings flew through the forest, making musical calls. The landscapes ranged from rolling hills to dramatic mountains to vast plains covered in purple grass. Tonight, Marcus and Nina sat together in the common room of the research facility. This was a shared space where scientists gathered to relax and socialize after long days of work. The room had comfortable furniture and large windows that showed the alien landscape outside. There was a kitchen area where people could prepare simple meals. Most importantly, there was a holographic display system that could receive broadcasts from Earth and other human colonies across the light years using quantum Ansible technology. They were watching a news broadcast from Earth. The program focused on the interstellar anti-discrimination conference that their father had organized. The conference had taken place 2 weeks ago, but the Ansible transmission had only just reached Kepler. Marcus and Nina watched with fascination as their father appeared on screen addressing a large assembly of delegates. The conference hall was packed with representatives from across human space, and even some alien species who had experienced discrimination within the coalition. Gregory stood at a podium speaking with the same calm authority that Marcus and Nina remembered. He talked about the incident involving his children and used it as a starting point for a broader discussion about justice and equity. He explained that when humanity left Earth and reached for the stars, they brought their best qualities with them. Their curiosity and determination and capacity for wonder, but they also brought their worst qualities. their prejudices and fears and tendency to divide the world into us versus them. Gregory said that if humanity wanted to thrive among the stars, they needed to leave those old hatreds behind. They needed to build something better. The delegates responded with enthusiastic applause. Representatives from dozens of organizations and hundreds of colonies stood and clapped. Even the alien delegates, who did not always understand human gestures, seemed to grasp the importance of what was being said. The holographic display showed faces from many different backgrounds, all united in support of the message. Nina watched the broadcast with tears in her eyes. She said their father had turned something awful into something meaningful. Marcus nodded in agreement. Their father had taken a painful personal experience and used it to spark a movement for change. That was incredible. The broadcast showed delegates signing a joint declaration that committed them to specific anti-discrimination measures. The document was not legally binding, but it carried significant moral weight. More importantly, it established accountability mechanisms that would make it harder for carriers and stations to ignore discriminatory practices. The program shifted to interviews with other conference attendees. Carlos Martinez appeared on screen. He was the civil rights officer who had helped Marcus and Nina file their initial complaint at Gateway Station. He had been promoted to oversee the station's newly expanded discrimination prevention program. He talked about the changes that had been implemented over the past 3 months. Mandatory training sessions had been conducted. New oversight procedures were in place. Several employees, including Velcorum, had been disciplined or reassigned. Lisa Chen also appeared in the broadcast. She was now heading up an industry-wide training initiative that had emerged from the conference. She explained how different carriers and stations were working together to develop consistent standards. They were sharing best practices and learning from each other's mistakes. The goal was to create a culture where discrimination was not tolerated anywhere in human-controlled space. It was ambitious, but the conference had generated real momentum for change. There was even a brief appearance by Velcorum himself. The Zentari attendant, whose actions had sparked the entire controversy, spoke about the mandatory training he had completed. He talked about his understanding of how his behavior had been wrong. He apologized to anyone he had mistreated. Marcus could not tell if the remorse was genuine or just performed for the cameras, but at least the attendant had been held accountable in some fashion. He had faced consequences for his discriminatory actions. The broadcast concluded with a segment about tangible changes that had been implemented across human space. Every major carrier had adopted new anti-discrimination protocols. Station operators had increased oversight of customer-facing staff. New mechanisms existed for passengers to report bias and seek redress. Anonymous complaint systems allowed people to report problems without fear of retaliation. Regular audits checked for patterns of discrimination. Passenger advocacy boards gave diverse communities a voice in station policies. The program noted that the changes were not perfect. Several incidents had occurred where the new protocols failed or were ignored. Change was incremental and often frustratingly slow, but it was happening. The conversation had shifted across human civilization. Discrimination that had once been quietly accepted was now being actively challenged. People were speaking up when they witnessed injustice. Organizations were being held accountable when they allowed bias to flourish. As the holographic display faded, Marcus and Nina sat in thoughtful silence. Outside the facility's windows, the alien landscape of Kepler stretched into the distance. 2 moons hung in the sky, casting silvery light across valleys and mountains. Strange plants that resembled trees but were not quite trees swayed in the gentle wind. It was a reminder that they were living on another world far from Earth. They were part of humanity's expansion into the cosmos. Nina broke the silence by asking if Marcus thought they had made a difference. Marcus considered the question carefully. He thought about the delegates at the conference and the new protocols being implemented. He thought about the conversations happening in boardrooms and government offices across human space. He thought about passengers who would now be treated fairly because systems had been put in place to prevent discrimination. He thought about all the people who had been inspired to speak up about their own experiences. Marcus said yes, he thought they had made a difference. Not just them, obviously. Their father deserved most of the credit, and Carlos and Lisa and everyone else who had turned their incident into a movement for change. But Marcus and Nina had started it by refusing to accept injustice, and by speaking up when it would have been easier to stay silent. Sometimes that was all it took to begin changing the world. One person or two people deciding that enough was enough. Nina smiled and said that was very HFY of them. Marcus laughed at the reference. HFY stood for Humanity Fuck Yeah, and it had originated on Earth as a celebration of human persistence and cleverness. In science fiction stories, it represented the idea that humans, despite their flaws, possessed certain qualities that allowed them to overcome challenges, determination and ingenuity, and the refusal to give up. Those traits had carried humanity from caves to cities to the stars. But Marcus had come to understand HFY in a different way. It was not just about technological achievements or military victories. It was about moral courage, about refusing to accept injustice even when fighting back was hard, about using whatever power or platform you had to make things better for others. That was the true measure of a species worthy of reaching the stars. Not the size of their ships or the power of their weapons, but the content of their character. Marcus looked at his sister and said they were living in one of the most exciting times in human history. They were exploring new worlds and meeting alien species and pushing the boundaries of knowledge. But none of that mattered if they could not treat each other with basic dignity and respect. The stars would still be there whether humans were worthy of them or not. What mattered was building a civilization that reflected the best of what humanity could be. Nina raised an imaginary glass in a toast. She said here was to not accepting injustice, to making noise when silence would be easier, to humanity, fuck yeah. Marcus clinked his imaginary glass against hers and repeated the toast. They sat together in comfortable silence, looking out at the alien world that was now their temporary home. Tomorrow they would return to their research, continuing the work of understanding this new ecosystem. But tonight they allowed themselves to reflect on what they had been through and what it had accomplished. The incident at Gateway Station had been painful and frustrating, but it had also been transformative not just for them, but for countless others who would benefit from the changes it sparked. That was the thing about confronting injustice. A week after watching the conference broadcast, Marcus received a message from his father. The quantum Ansible communication was expensive, so they did not talk often. But Gregory made a point of checking in on his children regularly to see how they were adjusting to life on Kepler. This message was longer than usual. Gregory wanted to share some updates about the ongoing work that had emerged from the conference. Gregory explained that the conference had exceeded his expectations. What started as a response to one incident had grown into a genuine movement. Multiple carriers and stations were competing to demonstrate their commitment to fairness. Some were motivated by genuine principle, while others simply wanted to avoid bad publicity. Either way, the result was positive change. New policies were being implemented faster than anyone had anticipated. The threat of public shaming through social media had proven to be a powerful motivator, but Gregory also warned that there would be setbacks. Some organizations would resist change. Some individuals would continue to discriminate even if it meant breaking new rules. The work of building a more just society was never finished. It required constant vigilance and constant effort. Marcus appreciated his father's honesty. It would have been easy to declare victory and move on. But real change required sustained commitment over years and decades, not just a single conference or a set of new policies. Gregory mentioned that he had been contacted by several news organizations wanting to interview Marcus and Nina. They wanted the siblings to tell their story in their own words. Gregory said the decision was entirely up to them. He would support whatever choice they made. Marcus discussed it with Nina later that evening. She was hesitant at first. The idea of talking publicly about what happened made her uncomfortable. It felt like exposing something private and painful to the entire galaxy. But Marcus pointed out that their story could help others. If people heard directly from them about what discrimination felt like, it might create more empathy and understanding. Abstract discussions of bias were one thing, but personal stories had power. They could make the issue real and immediate in ways that policy discussions could not. After thinking about it overnight, Nina agreed. They would do the interviews, but only with organizations that they trusted to handle the story respectfully. Over the next month, Marcus and Nina participated in several recorded interviews. The journalists asked thoughtful questions about their experience at Gateway Station. They wanted to know how it felt to be denied access to the lounge. They asked about the moment when their father arrived. They inquired about the changes that had resulted from the incident. Marcus and Nina answered honestly, sharing both the pain of discrimination and the hope that came from seeing people work for change. The interviews were broadcast across human space. Marcus and Nina received messages from hundreds of people. Some shared their own experiences with discrimination. Others thanked them for speaking up. A few sent angry messages accusing them of exaggerating or playing the victim. Those negative responses hurt, but they were far outnumbered by the supportive ones. Marcus began to understand the impact that sharing their story could have. Personal testimony had power that statistics and policy papers lacked. Meanwhile, their research work on Kepler continued. Marcus made several interesting discoveries about the microbial life in the planet's ecosystem. He found organisms that used completely different metabolic pathways than anything on Earth. His findings would contribute to the broader understanding of how life adapted to different planetary conditions. Nina's work on plant relationships revealed complex symbiotic networks that fascinated the botanical community. Both siblings were building solid reputations as researchers. One evening, Marcus was working late in the laboratory when his communicator chimed with an incoming call. He was surprised to see that it was from Carlos Martinez at Gateway Station. Marcus had not spoken with Carlos since filing the initial complaint 3 months ago. He answered the call and Carlos's face appeared on the holographic display. Carlos looked tired but pleased. He said he wanted to give Marcus an update on what had been happening at the station. Carlos explained that the changes at Gateway Station had been dramatic. All customer-facing staff had completed the mandatory training. Several employees who showed persistent bias despite the training had been reassigned to positions without public contact. The audit of past access denials had revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the previous year, dozens of passengers from minority backgrounds had been inappropriately turned away from premium facilities. The station was now reaching out to those passengers with apologies and compensation. But Carlos said the most significant change was cultural. Staff members were now actively looking out for discrimination. When someone witnessed biased behavior, they reported it immediately. The Passenger Advocacy Board was meeting regularly and providing valuable feedback. Complaints were taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. The station had gone from having one of the worst records for discrimination to becoming a model for other facilities. It showed that real change was possible when organizations committed to it. Marcus asked about Velcorum specifically. Carlos said the Zentari attendant had been reassigned to a cargo processing position, where he had no contact with passengers. He had completed all required training, but his supervisors felt he should not be in a customer-facing role. The decision was based on his history and his apparent inability to treat all passengers fairly. It was not as harsh as firing him, but it removed him from situations where he could harm others through his prejudice. After the call ended, Marcus sat quietly thinking about what Carlos had shared. The changes at Gateway Station were real and substantive. What had started with his and Nina's experience had grown into something much larger. But he also knew that one station changing its practices was not enough. The work needed to continue across all of human space. Every station and every carrier needed to make similar commitments. The conference had started that process, but it would take years to complete. Marcus shared the update with Nina the next morning. She was pleased to hear about the progress, but also asked the question that had been on Marcus's mind. What about all the other stations? What about the carriers that had not attended the conference? What about the countless facilities scattered across dozens of star systems? Change at one high-profile location was good, but systemic change required much more. They could not assume that everywhere would follow Gateway Station's example. That concern was addressed partly by Lisa Chen's industry-wide initiative. She sent Marcus and Nina regular updates about the training program she was developing. The program combined online modules with in-person workshops. It covered not just the rules against discrimination, but also the psychology of bias and the importance of active inclusion. Early results were promising. Organizations that completed the training showed measurable improvements in how they treated diverse passengers. But Lisa was also honest about the challenges. Some organizations resisted participating in the training. They claimed it was too expensive or too time-consuming. Some completed the training but did not implement the recommended practices. A few openly rejected the entire premise, arguing that businesses should be free to serve whoever they wanted. Lisa was working with regulatory agencies to create incentives for compliance. But she acknowledged that changing hearts and minds was harder than changing policies. 6 months after the incident, Marcus and Nina received an invitation that surprised them both. The Andromeda Trade Coalition was hosting its annual assembly on one of the central worlds. Gregory had been invited to speak about the discrimination conference and its outcomes. He wanted Marcus and Nina to join him on stage to share their perspective. The invitation was both an honor and a source of anxiety. Speaking at a coalition assembly meant addressing representatives from dozens of species and hundreds of governments. Marcus and Nina discussed whether to accept. The assembly would take place in 2 months, which meant they would need to take time away from their research. But it was also an incredible opportunity to advance the cause they had inadvertently started. Speaking at the coalition level could influence policy across not just human space, but the entire trade network. After talking it over with their research supervisor, who was supportive, they decided to accept the invitation. The next 2 months passed quickly. Marcus and Nina continued their research while also preparing for the assembly. They worked with their father and some communications advisors to develop their remarks. They wanted to be authentic and personal, while also conveying the broader importance of fighting discrimination. They practiced their speeches repeatedly until they felt comfortable with the content and delivery. It was different from their previous interviews because this would be live in front of a massive audience. As the date approached, Marcus felt increasingly nervous. He had never been comfortable with public speaking, even in small academic settings. The idea of addressing the coalition assembly was intimidating. But Nina reminded him why they were doing this. Their discomfort was minor compared to the potential good they could do. The Andromeda Trade Coalition Assembly was held on a planet called New Geneva. It was a neutral world that belonged to no single species or government. The planet served as the coalition's administrative headquarters and hosted major diplomatic events. The assembly hall was enormous, with seating for thousands of delegates. Holographic displays allowed the proceedings to be broadcast live across the galaxy. Security was tight, with scanners at every entrance and guards stationed throughout the facility. Marcus and Nina arrived with their father 3 days before they were scheduled to speak. Gregory wanted them to have time to acclimate to the environment and overcome any nervousness. They attended other sessions to get a feel for how the assembly worked. They watched as delegates debated trade policies and security arrangements and scientific cooperation. The diversity of the assembly was remarkable, with humans sitting beside aliens of every conceivable form. On the day of their presentation, Marcus woke early, feeling anxious. He had barely slept the night before. His mind kept racing through everything that could go wrong. What if he forgot his remarks? What if the translation devices malfunctioned and the alien delegates could not understand him? What if someone in the audience challenged their story or accused them of exaggerating? Nina seemed calmer, but Marcus knew his sister well enough to recognize that she was also nervous. They met their father for breakfast in the hotel restaurant. Gregory looked composed as always. He reminded them that they did not need to be perfect. They just needed to be honest and speak from the heart. People responded to authenticity more than polished presentations. The delegates wanted to hear their real experience, not some carefully crafted speech. Marcus tried to take comfort in those words, but his stomach still churned with anxiety. The session was scheduled for the afternoon. They arrived at the assembly hall an hour early to go through final preparations. A technician fitted them with small microphones that would pick up their voices and feed them into the translation system. Another technician tested the holographic displays that would project their images to delegates in the far reaches of the enormous hall. Everything seemed to be working properly. Marcus tried to focus on breathing slowly and staying calm. When it was finally time, they walked onto the stage together. The hall was packed with delegates from across the coalition. Marcus saw humans of every background sitting in designated sections. He saw the blue-skinned Centaurians and the crystalline Rigelians. He saw species he could not identify with body types that seemed impossible. All of them turned their attention to the stage as Gregory began speaking. His voice was steady and confident as he introduced the topic of discrimination in commercial spaceflight. Gregory spoke for 10 minutes, providing context about the conference and the changes that had been implemented. Then he introduced Marcus and Nina. He explained briefly what had happened to them at Gateway Station. He said they would share their perspective in their own words. Marcus stepped forward to the podium, feeling his heart pound in his chest. For a moment he looked out at the sea of faces and felt overwhelmed. Then he remembered why he was here and began to speak. Marcus described arriving at Gateway Station after 3 weeks of travel. He talked about being tired and wanting to rest in the premium lounge that their credentials entitled them to access. He explained how the attendant had refused to scan their credentials and had turned them away with barely disguised contempt. His voice was quiet at first but grew stronger as he continued. He wanted the delegates to understand what discrimination felt like in that moment. The anger and frustration and sense of powerlessness. Nina spoke next. She talked about watching the attendant treat other passengers with courtesy while treating them with suspicion. She described the feeling of being judged not by who they were or what they had accomplished, but by how they looked. She spoke about the exhaustion of dealing with discrimination not just once but repeatedly throughout your life. The small indignities that accumulated over time, the constant need to prove yourself worthy of basic respect that others received automatically. The hall was completely silent as they spoke. Thousands of delegates listened intently. Some looked uncomfortable while others nodded in recognition. Marcus realized that many beings in this room had experienced similar discrimination. The specifics varied, but the core experience of being treated as less than others was universal. It happened between species and within species. It was one of the uglier aspects of civilized society that persisted despite technological progress. Marcus concluded his remarks by talking about hope. He said their story could have ended with them walking away defeated and silent. But they chose to speak up and file a complaint. Their father chose to use his position to demand accountability. Organizations chose to implement real changes. Thousands of people chose to support the movement for fairness. All of those choices together created momentum for change. One incident at one station had sparked a galaxy-wide conversation. That showed the power of refusing to accept injustice. Nina added her final thoughts. She said change was hard and slow and often disappointing, but it was possible. The past 6 months had proven that. Carriers and stations across human space were implementing new policies. Training programs were teaching people to recognize and combat bias. Passengers were speaking up when they witnessed discrimination. The work was far from finished, but genuine progress had been made. That progress came from people deciding that the status quo was unacceptable. When they finished speaking, the delegates responded with thunderous applause. Beings of many species rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Marcus felt tears in his eyes as he looked out at the assembly. These were representatives from civilizations far older and more advanced than humanity. Yet they were acknowledging the importance of the message. They were recognizing that discrimination undermined everything the coalition stood for. The moment felt profound, and Marcus knew he would remember it for the rest of his life. After the session ended, many delegates approached to speak with them. A Centaurian diplomat thanked them for their courage in sharing such a personal story. A human representative from a distant colony said she had experienced similar treatment and felt less alone knowing others understood. Even a Rigelian whose crystalline body made expressions difficult somehow conveyed sympathy and support. Marcus and Nina spent hours talking with delegates and answering questions. That evening, the coalition announced a new initiative. They would establish a coalition-wide office dedicated to combating discrimination in all commercial activities. The office would have enforcement powers and could investigate complaints across species boundaries. It would work to develop universal standards that all member organizations would need to follow. The announcement was a direct result of the session and the conversation that Marcus and Nina had helped start. Later that night, Marcus sat with Nina on a balcony overlooking the city. New Geneva was beautiful at night, with lights from many different architectural styles blending together. Ships of various designs came and went from the spaceport. It was a visible reminder of the diversity that made the coalition strong. Marcus reflected on everything that had happened since that day at Gateway Station. A simple denial of lounge access had grown into a movement that was now influencing policy at the highest levels of galactic governance. Nina asked if he thought they had really made a difference. Marcus smiled and said he was certain of it, not because they were special or heroic, but because they had refused to stay silent. That refusal, combined with their father's support and the efforts of countless others, had created real change. The new coalition office would help beings across many species. The training programs would reduce discrimination. The policies being implemented would make travel fairer for everyone. Those were concrete, measurable improvements. But Marcus also acknowledged that the work was not finished. Discrimination would not disappear overnight. There would be setbacks and failures. Some organizations would resist change. Some individuals would continue to harbor prejudice. The fight for justice was ongoing and required constant effort. Each generation had to choose whether to accept the world as it was or work to make it better. Marcus and Nina had made their choice. They would keep speaking up and keep fighting for what was right. They sat in comfortable silence watching the city lights. Tomorrow they would return to Kepler to continue their research. The planets and stars were waiting to be studied. The universe was vast and full of mysteries, but for tonight they allowed themselves to simply exist in this moment. They had stood before the Coalition Assembly and shared their truth. They had contributed to making the galaxy a more just place. That was something to be proud of. Marcus thought about all the travelers who would pass through Gateway Station and other facilities in the coming years. He thought about people of all backgrounds being treated fairly, because systems were now in place to prevent discrimination. He thought about employees who would think twice before acting on their prejudices, knowing they would face real consequences. He thought about passengers who would feel empowered to speak up when they witnessed injustice. All of those small changes would add up to something significant. An hour passed while Marcus and Nina rested in the lounge. They watched other passengers come and go. They saw the staff treating everyone with courtesy, though Marcus wondered if that courtesy was genuine or just a response to the earlier incident. News had clearly spread among the lounge workers. They all seemed nervous and overly attentive. Every few minutes someone would approach to ask if Marcus and Nina needed anything. It became almost uncomfortable after a while. Gregory returned looking tired but satisfied. He settled into a chair beside his children and accepted another cup of coffee from a hovering attendant. For a moment he just sat quietly gathering his thoughts. Then he looked at Marcus and Nina with an expression that combined pride and sadness. He said he was sorry they had to experience what happened today. He said no one should be judged by how they looked rather than by who they were. His voice carried the weight of personal experience. Nina spoke softly. She said this was not the first time something like this had happened to them. She said it would not be the last time either. Gregory's jaw tightened. He said he knew that all too well. He explained that he had dealt with discrimination his entire career. People had assumed he was a janitor instead of an executive. He had been followed in stores as if he were a thief. His credentials had been questioned when he presented them, just like what happened to his children today. The difference was that now he held a position where he could push back and demand accountability. Marcus leaned forward with interest. He asked his father what they had accomplished in the meeting with Station Director Kim. Gregory took a sip of coffee before responding. He explained that the director had agreed to a comprehensive review of all diversity and inclusion practices at the station. This would include all the measures Lisa Chen had mentioned, plus additional oversight mechanisms. The station would also publish regular reports on their progress so everyone could see if real changes were happening. But Gregory said there was something even more significant. He had arranged for Stellar Transit Lines to sponsor an interstellar conference on discrimination in commercial spaceflight. The conference would bring together carriers, station operators, and civil rights organizations from across human space. The goal was to develop industry-wide standards that everyone would follow. Individual incidents were important, but systemic change required coordinated action across the entire industry. Nina's eyes widened. She said their father was using this incident to push for broader change beyond just one station. Gregory nodded. He explained that what happened to them was part of a larger pattern. Discrimination did not just hurt individuals, though that was bad enough. It undermined the entire promise of the Andromeda Trade Coalition. The coalition was supposed to represent the idea that different species and cultures could work together as equals. If they could not live up to that ideal among their own species, what hope was there for truly accepting alien partners? Gregory paused, and his expression grew more serious. He said he wanted his children to understand something important. Yes, he had used his position and his company's leverage to get results today, but that did not mean the fight was over. Systems did not change because one executive threw his weight around. They changed because ordinary people refused to accept injustice even when it was easier to stay silent. He told Marcus and Nina that they had done the right thing by standing up for themselves and filing a complaint. Helen Porter added her perspective. She said Marcus and Nina should be proud of how they handled the situation. They had remained calm and collected evidence. They had sought help from the Civil Rights Office. They had documented everything properly. Those actions were just as important as Gregory's intervention. Without their initial response, there would have been nothing for Gregory to work with. Change required both individual courage and institutional power working together. A chime sounded from Gregory's datapad. He checked it and announced that the flight to Kepler would begin boarding in 30 minutes. It was time to head to the departure gate. They gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the lounge. As they stood up, Marcus noticed that other passengers were watching them. Some looked curious while others appeared uncomfortable. A few offered small nods of acknowledgement or support. One older woman approached and quietly thanked Gregory for what he was doing. She said her grandson had faced similar treatment at another station. They made their way through the station toward the departure gate. Gregory walked between his children with one hand on each of their shoulders. Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions. He was grateful for his father's support and proud of what they had accomplished. But he also felt frustrated that such intervention had been necessary in the first place. They should have been able to access the lounge on their own merit without needing someone powerful to fight for them. The departure gate was busy with passengers checking in and preparing to board. Marcus and Nina presented their boarding passes to the gate agent, who scanned them without any problems. Gregory would not be traveling with them. He had meetings scheduled back at the company headquarters on one of the orbital stations. He pulled both of his children into a brief embrace. His voice was rough with emotion when he told them he was proud of them for standing up for themselves and refusing to just accept what happened. Nina hugged her father tightly. She thanked him for coming to the station and for making people listen. Gregory smiled and said that was what fathers do. He told them to go ahead and conduct their research and explore the colony on Kepler. He told them to make him proud through their work and their character. Marcus promised they would. He shook his father's hand, feeling the strength and warmth in his grip. Then Gregory stepped back and watched as his children joined the line of passengers boarding the ship. As they walked down the boarding tunnel, Nina turned to her brother. She said it felt different leaving the station than it had felt arriving. Marcus understood exactly what she meant. They had come to Gateway Station as anonymous travelers, just two young people starting an adventure. They were leaving as something else. They were witnesses to injustice and catalysts for change. What had started as a simple denial of lounge access had grown into something much bigger. It had exposed systemic problems and forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. The ship that would take them to Kepler was smaller than the transport they had arrived on. It was designed for shorter journeys within a single star system, rather than the long hauls between systems. The interior was clean and modern with comfortable seats and good visibility through the windows. Marcus and Nina found their assigned seats near the middle of the cabin. They stowed their bags in the overhead compartments and settled in for the flight. Other passengers filled the remaining seats. There was a mix of humans and a few aliens. Most seemed to be researchers or workers heading to the colony on Kepler. Marcus overheard conversations about mining operations and agricultural experiments and xenobiology studies. He felt a renewed sense of excitement about his own research. After the stress of the day, it would be good to focus on something productive and meaningful. Studying the unique microbial life on Kepler seemed like a welcome escape from human complications. The ship's captain made an announcement over the intercom system. She welcomed everyone aboard and outlined the flight plan. The journey to Kepler would take approximately 4 hours. She advised passengers to remain seated during departure and to follow all safety instructions. The crew would be serving a meal about halfway through the flight. Marcus felt the ship begin to move as it detached from the station's docking arm. Through the window, he could see Gateway Station slowly receding as they pulled away. Nina looked out the window at the station. She wondered what would happen there in the coming weeks and months. Would the promised changes actually occur? Would the training programs make a difference? Would other travelers be treated more fairly because of what happened today? It was impossible to know for sure. Change was slow and often disappointing. But at least they had tried to make things better. At least they had not stayed silent in the face of injustice. Marcus pulled out his datapad and started reading about the research facility where they would be working. The colony on Kepler was relatively new with only about 5,000 permanent residents. Most were scientists or support staff working on various research projects. The planet itself was remarkably Earth-like with breathable atmosphere and moderate temperatures. It had diverse ecosystems that humanity was still cataloging and studying. The microbial life that Marcus would be studying showed some fascinating adaptations to the local environment. As the ship accelerated away from the station, Marcus reflected on the day's events. They had faced discrimination and stood up against it. They had involved their father, who used his position to demand accountability. They had sparked a conversation that would hopefully lead to real change, but Marcus knew that one incident and one powerful person's intervention would not solve everything. Discrimination was deeply rooted in human society. It had existed for thousands of years on Earth, and humans had carried it with them into space. The flight progressed smoothly. The ship's engines hummed steadily as they traveled through space.